Hello and welcome to a deck profile for the standard format. My first one back for the new year. Today we're talking about King Levidras, which is a very strong contender in the meta right now, which I'm excited for because I was a fan of the old Levidras deck, and being able to see the Bug Dragon take the top tables is really gratifying. Levidras is a deck based around putting Infinity Eyes markers on the opponent's and your side of the field, giving units plus 10k or minus 10k with those markers, and then gradually playing a long game with a 5 attack pattern that hits pretty decent numbers while having a lot of defensive power. The weaknesses of this deck are mainly that it has fake hand syndrome. You have a lot of grade 3s and cards that don't do anything in the early game, so you're susceptible to early rush. And then on top of that, you are also piece reliant, so if you brick on the wrong card at the wrong time, the whole deck can fall apart, especially when you're going second. But if everything comes together, this deck is so strong that it makes up for those weaknesses. Without any further ado, let's get into the ride line. You have to play this ride line, the Levidras ride line. These reference each other by name, and because of the constraints of building this deck, we can't really get any use out of the other ride lines in Stoicheia. Starting with our grade 0, Stagnipper Dragon. It's just a generic D starter. It's important because Scorepiercer Dragon, our grade 1, references it. This card, if you have a 0 in your soul with this name, when you would ride up to the 2, you get a free ride. And then the 2, Manta Scythe Dragon. When you ride over this with a Levidras, you get to Energy Blast 3 and look at the top 5 and add one of them to your hand. A grade 3 or less from among them to your hand, which is going to be everything in the deck. And then you shuffle. So this is really important because we're heavily piece reliant now. So getting to dig with a top 5 check for that piece, very solid. And then Destined King of Infinity Levidras Imperio is our new main Vanguard. You will play this on the ride deck. It is strictly better than the old Levidras. And it's just a really, really solid card. So what this does is it's regarded as the same name as the old one for synergy purposes. And then it gets 5k and the divine skill of each Levidras in your soul. 5k for each Levidras, and then it gets the divine skill. Sorry to clarify. So that means that it has self-scaling, which is really solid. And then it has an act skill, counter +1, or put a card from hand to soul. You're going to put an old Levidras when possible. Choose 2 of any player's R and put an Infinity Eyes marker. And if you have a grade 3, if you used a grade 3 Levidras for the cost of this, you put 3 instead of 2. So this is going to help us get all of our effects active right away because a lot of the Levidras support is gated behind having 3 of your own markers in play somewhere. On top of that, this also doesn't restrict us to putting them on any particular player's side, whereas the old Levidras, you had to go 1 on each player. So this means that we can go pure defensive and put all our markers on the opponent, or pure offense, put all of them on our side, or mix of the two, depending on what the situation calls for. That gives us a lot more flexibility and a lot more control over the outcome of the match, which is really good. On top of that, it's important to note that there's an interaction with, or there's a rule thing to know about multiple markers on the same circle. Because the markers themselves are blank, they do nothing. The Vanguard has a skill underneath this ability describing putting the markers, where when a unit on R with a marker attacks or boosts, you give it +10 or -10, and if it was an opponent's unit and you gave it -10, you remove the marker and draw a card. That is the ability that makes the markers do something. So if you double up markers, the Vanguard skill doesn't say for each marker. It just checks if there's a marker on that circle, and then it applies this effect. And then if you give -10 to an opponent's unit, then you remove 1 and draw. So if you have 2 markers, that one attack will only trigger once. And that means that there's not a lot of usage for doubling up on the same circle, with one exception. If the opponent is playing a deck that restands their units or superior calls to the same circle, then it can be worth it to double up markers on that circle, because then you can shrink 2 different attacks. But your opponent can play around this if they're playing a superior call multi-attack deck by calling to the other column. And thus, you'll get kind of punished for that. So if you really want to shrink 1 big attack, because you can't use 2 markers on the same attack, what you got to do is put a marker on the booster and then shrink the booster, which will effectively shrink the unit. And they have to choose between not boosting, in which case the attack's small, or boosting and giving you another card and giving themselves another -10. So you can basically shut off boosters, because that outcome is usually bad for the opponent. And then on top of that, there's another niche interaction with Shiranui. If Shiranui dominates one of your units on your own circle with your marker, you can remove the marker and get 10k, or get -10k to the attacker and draw a card. Most dominate attacks are 10k shield to guard, if they're a grade 2 or a grade 3. With the exception of if they use the grade 2 from their ride line to give +10, in which case you're just countering that out, and then you can guard with any 10k, like double intercept or something. So that is an important interaction to keep track of, and drawing that extra card against Shiranui can be the difference between life or death. So it's something to keep your eye out for, but you will reduce your own scaling, so keep that in mind. And then let's get into the main deck. We're maxing out on Persona Ride. For obvious reasons, Persona Ride's really strong for tempo, and we don't have a ton of kill pressure compared to other decks, so getting all the additional power we can get is important. And then we have 4 copies of the old levidras, specifically for the purpose of putting into Soul with new levidras' skill. That is the only reason we play this. Theoretically, in some kind of scenario where you're out of, where you have Counterblast, but you don't have Persona Ride, you could ride new old levidras over it to get Persona Ride, and then use this skill, which would get you only 2 markers, but would get you Persona Ride. So it might be the difference between winning or losing, especially if you only need 2 markers. If you only need like 1 more marker to get a full board of markers or something like that, it might come up. But generally speaking, it's going to be better just to put this into Soul, because you'll get more power in your Vanguard too. So that's the only reason we're playing it. Try not to discard these for Ride if you can, because you're going to use multiples of these over the course of a game. This is a grindy deck, so hold on to them if possible. And that's part of the reason we have Fake Hand Syndrome. We're trying to hold Persona Ride. We're trying to hold this. It's a lot. Next up is our last grade 3. 4 copies of Knight of Formosity Charmnet. This is our best attacker. It's really good. It has a drop zone skill. If there are 3 or more Infinity Eyes markers that you have, 3 or more of your markers, and you don't have another copy of this card in play, you can Soul Blast 1 and call it from drop. Really good way to build our board up, which is one of the things Levidras used to struggle with, was rebuilding a board every turn, because you need a full board to get your maximum power every single turn. And so getting 1 more card that calls itself from drop is just really solid. Then when this unit attacks, if your Infinity Eyes markers in the same column, remember that includes the opponent's side, retire another rear guard, and this unit gets plus 10k until the end of that battle, and at the end of that battle, retire this unit and draw a card. Remember that we have units that are useless after they've entered play once, and so retiring them and then replacing them with a fresh unit on the next turn is really good. And we're going to call this card back from drop. So really, we're not even losing that much from retiring 2 of our own units, and we're going to draw a card. Really, really good. We can engineer scenarios where we leave no units in play against Shiranui, which is very nice. But because they've changed back to the structure deck ride line, that isn't as useful as it sounds. Sorry about that. Next up, we have 4 copies of Onfall and Odogaster. This is one of the most important cards of the deck. On place, you Energy Blast 3 if you have Infinity Eyes marker in the same column, and you look at the top 2 cards of the deck, and you choose one from among them, put it in your hand, and then you put the rest on the top or bottom. So you're stacking triggers or important pieces that you need to drive check, and then you're putting the rest of the bottom. And then this unit gets 5k. And then during your turn, if you have a grade 3 Levidras Vanguard and you have 3 or more markers, then this unit gets plus 5k, and you can back row attack as long as it's the only copy of this card in the back row. So only 1 Onfall and Odogaster back row attack per turn, which is important to note. You can have another one in the front row, though, and that's fine. And so this is a really good card. It's going to be 20k on its own on the turn it's placed down with 3 markers, and then put it on a circle with Infinity Eyes marker, and it's hitting for 30k, which hits over a 15k shield. Really solid. Next up is Skulk Claws Huntsman Huli. For Counterblast 1, if you have a marker in the same column as the unit, you can choose a grade 3 or less card from your drop and call it to R, and then this unit gets 10k if you have 3 or more markers, which is going to be every turn because new Levidras gives us 3 markers. So this is going to give us much needed power. In a front row circle with an Infinity Eyes marker and Persona Ride, it's hitting for 40, which is really good. That hits over front trigger guard, which is nice. And in a back row with an Infinity Eyes marker, it's still hitting for 30, and then 40 if you give it the power from Foxhole. So no matter what, it's good, and it hits for 30 without a marker with Persona Ride. So no matter what, it's hitting over a good shield threshold. But it loses that 10k power at the end of turn, so this is a strong candidate for retiring with Charmnet or just intercepting. Next up, we have 4 copies of the Dual Nation Keter Stoicheia card, Azure Sky White Scale Aspronia and Saphira, I think it's called. Yep. So when this is placed on R from hand, other than during battle phase, you look at the top card of the deck and you can put it in the drop or leave it on top. And then you can Counterblast 1 and choose one of the following, and choose a normal order from the drop and put it in hand, or choose a grade 2 or greater card from your drop and call it to R. So this is just another way to build our board back up. It's a way to stack triggers on top, which is really important because we only get 2 drive checks and we don't have a ton of kill pressure, so hitting triggers every turn is really good. And being able to try to stack for heals is really solid if you've got crit early and you need to heal back down to have a chance. Overall, it's a pretty decent card, but it's probably the first on the chopping block if we get any better support in the future. Next up is our grade 1s, and we have 3 copies of Full Knowledge Foxhole. This is the Levidras booster. It's a 15k booster for Levidras specifically, and then when it boosts Levidras, you can counterblast 1. If you have a marker on the opponent's side that you gave them, you can choose a back row unit and give it 10k and back row attack. So this is how you get 5 attacks. This plus On-Fall Notigaster is 5 attacks. And it's going to be good numbers, and it synergizes really well with our next grade 1, which I'll get to in a second. We only need to play 3 now because we only need one of these and play it once. And we have 8 cards in our deck that call something from drop, so if the opponent retires it, it's not the end of the world. Next up is 3 copies of Inquisitive Squirrel. This is the card that people are complaining about the most from this deck, which, sure, I guess it leads to your highest power ceiling turns, but I do think this card's actually overrated. It doesn't help you solve any of the problems of the deck. It doesn't help you early. It doesn't help you not brick. It doesn't help you find consistency for pieces. All it is just big numbers, and doesn't plus any cards in a deck that really needs the plus cards to keep getting it set up every turn. So I think this is another card that we might cut if we ever get better support for this deck. And I would play fewer of this if I could. But at the end of the battle, this unit boosted. You Soul Blast 1, and you move this unit from to an open back row circle. And if you moved it to a circle with an Infinity Eyes marker, you stand this unit, and it gets plus 5k until end of turn. So the reason this is so strong is that if you give it plus 10k with Foxhole, it's going to be 18 and then 23. Or if you're moving it between 2 circles with markers, it'll be 28 and then 33, which is really good numbers. And because you're boosting, you're going to make one of your attacks really, really big with that first boost. Usually it's going to be your Charm Net. Your Charm Net's going to be hitting for 50 to 60 with that power, because Charm Net's 23 with its own skill. Persona Ride, 33, and then plus 18k from this will get you to 51, and then 61 if you have a marker on either of the circles in that column, which is a pretty good number. If you have a marker on both circles in that column, you can hit over the OT guard, which is nice. And then you're usually going to be retiring the On-Fall Notigaster that was in the other back row spot, and you're going to move this to that spot, which hopefully has a marker on it, and you're going to get another attack in the 30k range, which is going to be a lot of shield value out of the opponent's hand. It's going to hit over front trigger guard, which is really good. It's going to demand 2 cards in their hand at least. And if you hit any triggers with your Vanguard, putting them on Squirrel means you get to use them twice. So if you hit the over trigger, you can boost with this to give something 100 million, and then move it to the other circle and swing for 100 million, and get 200 million swings in one turn, which can get through your opponent's own defensive OT sometimes. So overall, really solid card. I do think it's a little overrated in that it's not as broken as people say. I think there are other things in the deck you could touch if you wanted to nerf this deck with a banning. But for now, this seems to be the card people complain about the most. Maybe I'm the crazy one. Who knows? Next up, we have our PGs, 3 normal unit PGs and 1 Elementaria. This is just pretty standard for any deck in Overdress format. And then 1 Protection Twincast. We don't really get a lot of benefit out of our Regalis piece slot. Bracing Angel Ladder, not super important anymore right now because Shoujo and Shiranui are both falling off. And the other best decks in the format are Reziel, which doesn't care about ladder. Night Rose does pretty good in Japan, I think, and doesn't care about ladder. This deck doesn't really care about ladder because it doesn't choose. So ladder doesn't do anything to it. So really, there's not much in the format right now in the top tier decks that we really need to worry about for ladder. Like if I go to Japanese format, filter by set 5 meta, the best decks are Reziel, Levidras, Love, Varga. Varga's the only one. Leal Odium to a degree as well, but that matchup is a close to grindy one. And then, yeah, ladder is not really going to improve our win rate against any of these top tier decks. So we can throw that out. We don't really need the Persona Red Cup, so we can reject that. Radiance Caliburn is interesting. We could get Countercharge and Soul Generation, or we could draw 2 cards. But at the end of the day, It's another grade 3 that doesn't help us survive, and a deck that already has Fake Hand Syndrome, so we don't want to play that. So that leaves pretty much just Protection Twin Cast or Evergreen Transfer or Forbidal. We don't want to play Forbidal because we only have one good grade 3 in this deck that we'd want to call. So we can reject Forbidal unless we wanted to tech in a one of Inlet Pulse Dragon or something to get a Soul Generation and card draw in the middle of the battle phase. But unlikely that we're ever going to do that. So it's Protection Twin Cast or Evergreen Transfer, and the argument for Evergreen Transfer is it blocks one big attack and can deal with the overtrigger, whereas Protection Twin Cast can block 2 attacks potentially, especially if you're using your markers to shrink the opponent's attacking units. Next up is our triggers, and we have 4 vanilla heals. Again, none of the top tier threats in the format right now care about the effect heals, with the exception maybe of Varga. And Varga is already a really favorable matchup for this deck, because we can, their rearguard swings are bad and will give us more cards if we put markers there, and then we will have a higher chance of perfect guarding their Vanguard. So we don't really have to worry about Varga. So 4 vanilla heals will give you the best matchup spread. Then we play 8 crits, 4 vanilla crits, and I'm playing for this effect crit for no reason other than I like the art. Just play 8 crits of whatever kind you like. Then we have our effect fronts, Frenzied Heiress. This is a change from the old list. Before we were playing draw triggers, which would still be interesting. It would give us more defensive power if we hit them defensively, and then would help us dig for pieces. But right now, the attack pattern in the deck has been improved because we no longer play Clarence. So we have fewer scenarios where we have to get rid of a front row unit before the Vanguard swing. So that means that fronts will usually get their maximum value, especially if the opponent 2 to passes us and we stacked a front on top. And then on top of that, the shield value early is much better, especially in this format. Draw triggers are only 5k shield until the opponent's on grade 3, so they don't stop a Vanguard swing unboosted in the early game, whereas this will. It will make it 2 to pass. And when you're going second and your opponent gets up to grade 3 first, these will be 20k shields and will help you stay at low damage, whereas a draw trigger will only be 10k shield, and a lot of stuff will still hit over that. So even though you have more potential survivability if you hit draw triggers defensively, if they end up in your hand, front triggers are a lot better. And front triggers give you some much needed kill pressure, and we already have a lot of defense once we're into the late game with levidras, because we can put markers on the opponent's side. Next up, we have the overtrigger. We're playing the Stoicheia overtrigger because it is better than the blue, red, dark, or light OT for this deck. It gives you 1 of every trigger effect, which is just really solid. It's a potential heal and crit, which could be a 2 damage swing off of one thing. And the front trigger effect is really nice. It basically ends up being a huge swing in our favor if we hit this. Even if the opponent survives, they're going to be down a lot more cards, and we're going to be up a lot more cards. So that is the main deck. Let's get into what the attack pattern might look like. Ideally, we will have mulliganed hard to find a levidras. This is priority number 1. Put 5 back if you don't have a levidras in your hand, in my opinion. And then we'll get that as well. We'll put markers. Usually, it's safe to go markers on the opponent's side like this, so that we just have the maximum amount of survivability. They're not going to be doing a lot on their first grade 3 turn without Persona Ride. And then we want to have hopefully discarded one of these to ride up, so we can call it for Soul Blast from the drop. We try not to Soul Blast out your levidrases because they give you an additional 5k power. We would ideally want a Foxel at some point to boost the Vanguard to get our maximum number of attacks, an On-Fall Anotogaster in order to check the top 2 and potentially stack triggers, and then probably something like Aspronia, Saphira, and maybe a Squirrel to correct this pattern a little bit. We might do something like this on our first turn riding up. Well, let's say it's a Huli, actually, so that the number's a bit better. So, with no markers, this turn is kind of underwhelming, but I'll show you the numbers again with markers on the Persona Ride turn, so you can see how high the kill pressure is for this deck. So this would be a 20k attacker. So we swing here boosted. We're going to counterblast 1 to give Foxel 10k, or not Foxel, Squirrel 10k and back row attack. This is going to have 10k from its 2 effects. And then this will have 10k from its own effect. And then Charm Net right now has no additional power. We swing here. We presumably stacked a trigger with On-Fall Anotogaster. So let's say that we hit a critical trigger. and we put a crit on the charm net and 10k on the squirrel. So then we can do something like this. We can swing for 20 here, the smallest number. We can swing for 30 here with the marker giving it increased power. Then we can swing boosted and retire this on-fall Notogaster, which will give this unit an additional 10k power. So this is going to be 23 base, and then 10k from the Foxhole boosting the squirrel, so that's 33, and then 41 total. There's another 10k because we hit a trigger, which we put on the squirrel. So it'll be 51 on turn 3 with the opponent at grade 2, and there's a crit here. So that's pretty hard to guard. They're going to have to dump a PG with a small hand if they went second, because they haven't gotten a twin drive turn yet. That's going to get a lot of shield out of their hand. Then this is going to retire itself and we'll draw a card. Then this will Soul Blast a card, and we will move it to the other circle, where it's going to get an additional 5k power. And it's going to keep all of its power increases from the other trigger and from Foxhole skill. So now it's coming in for 43, which is a really good number. That's going to hit over double trigger guard. And then on the opponent's turn, we're going to be able to draw 2 cards off of our markers when they attack. And they kind of have to attack because if they're not attacking us, what are they doing? How are they going to win? We have an interceptor here. We will presumably have gotten, we'll have one more card from Drive Check, and then we'll have like whatever cards we didn't use. So we're going to have, we ended up with like 5 cards from where we started. And we can take a lot of damage here, and it's fine. And then we go back to our turn. And now I'll show you what the turn would look like with lots of markers. So we can Persona Ride, we can draw a card, we can add a levidras into Soul to get more markers. So we can go 2 on the opponent's side again, and then we can put 1 here on our side. And then we can Divine Skill for Soul Blast 1. And we can get another marker on the opponent's side, either behind a rearguard booster or behind a vanguard booster. And we get 1 more marker on our side. So we can do something like this. We still have this squirrel here. The vanguard gets plus 10k and a crit from Divine Skill. And then it gets plus 10k for having 2 old levidrasses in Soul. We can Soul Blast 1 to call this card back. We can Soul Blast out the Persona Road over Levidras. Keep the old Levidrasses in Soul. Try to Soul Blast out new ones if you have to. And then if one of the... I kind of just grabbed from the sorted deck, so right now my hand's all Levidrasses. But if I assume that I drew at least 1 card that calls something back from the drop, like a Huli or, let's say, an Aspronia Sphere, then we get to call On-Fall Notogaster back. And we have a full board again off of the only cards we needed to draw to get this again was another old Levidras and 1 card that calls something from the drop, and suddenly we have everything back. And we still have 2 markers on the opponent's side to survive their turn. So our Vanguard is plus 20 right now. This card is going to be plus 10 for the marker. This card is going to stack the deck again, presumably between milling a card with this. If we saw normally not on top, we're very likely to have a trigger on top. So let's just say we have a crit. Because either this, if this saw a non-trigger, we just leave it. Or if this saw a trigger, we leave it. If we saw a non-trigger, we mill it. And then if this doesn't see a trigger in the top 2, that's really unlikely. So the numbers with Persona Ride and this turn setup right now are looking pretty good. We swing with Vanguard. We counterblast. We give Foxhole 10k and back row attack. Or not Foxhole, Squirrel, sorry. And then we drive check our crit. We do the same thing again. We put the crit here. We put the power on the Squirrel. And then other drive check doesn't matter. Then this is the smallest attack. This is 30. This is 30. There's an argument for not attacking with this first. So we swing at this back row, and I'll explain it in a second. So this is going to be 30k. And then we swing here boosted. And the reason we do that is because this is going to retire the On-Fall Notogaster. As expected, we're going to draw a card. And then this number is going to get plus 10k more. So this is 33, 53, 61, 71. This is a gigantic number. And then after that, this is going to retire and we draw a card. Or no, I already put the card in my hand for that, I think. And then this will move over here for Soul Blast 1. We actually would have potentially more Soul, but it's okay if we lose like 1 Levidras here. But theoretically, this wouldn't be an issue normally. We have this card here now, and this card still in front of it, having not attacked. If the opponent hit a couple defensives, the reason we could do this way is that now we can swing boosted and get one more gigantic attack. Because this would be plus 10 for the marker, plus 10 for persona. This would be 30. This got the power moved over, and then it got an additional 5k from its own skill. So this is 30, 50, 55, 63, 73. If they hit double defensive, this is a very threatening attack. If they didn't hit defensives, then we go 30, and then we go 43, which is pretty scary. If we hit double trigger, this is even bigger. If we hit double trigger, then it's 53, or this boosted attack was 83. And so this is pretty hard to guard. If the opponent is at high damage, pushed up already, this can be a nightmare to fight through. If we hit over trigger, again, this would be 100 million twice. So hitting the over trigger with Squirrel in play is usually a death sentence for the opponent. Usually. They could heal out of it. They could have perfect guards, whatever. But as you can see, we're once again positioned to have this set up again the next turn. Really, all we need to do is draw either another On-Fallen Odogaster or any card that calls from drop. So one of our 8 cards that calls something from drop for a counterblast. We're using 1 CB a turn on Foxel every turn, and we're putting a card from hand into Soul for levidras. So the other CB we would use is free to be used on this. We could, if we draw another On-Fallen Odogaster, though, we can save the CB, we can just play one from hand, and then we can just Soul Blast to get back this card. And this setup loops itself every turn. Basically, you're consuming at most 2 counterblasts in one turn, but usually 1 counterblast in a turn, depending on how much you needed to intercept or how much your opponent kills your units, that sort of thing. Like if they kill our Foxel, obviously we're going to need to draw one of these to call the Foxel back. But that means that you have a lot of stability over a long game, and if you're also controlling your damage well and healing, then you get a lot of mileage out of this stuff. And again, it's not the end of the world if we brick and we can't use a Foxel one turn. We can still get 4 attacks, and we can still double boost with a Squirrel, which is pretty nice. We can do something like, if we have that set up where we didn't get Foxel because we didn't have Counterblast, then our 4 attack pattern looks something like this. It's swing with On-Fallen Odogaster, swing with Charmnet boosted, retire this, Soul Blast, retire this, draw a card, Soul Blast 1, move this over here, and then we get to boost again. And it's only 4 attacks, but but 2 of these attacks were really high power. It'll have less power because one of the 10k from Foxel, but it'll still get another 5k. If we hit a trigger, it'll be another 10k, and then the marker will give it another 10k. So it's still overall with the marker plus 25, so it's 33, and that means this is a 63k attack. So even if we have to go for 4 attacks, it's not the end of the world. The numbers are actually really solid. Now the problem is that 1 or 2 of these attacks are easy to guard. 1 or 2 of these attacks are really big. And that means that if your opponent has a good hand defensively, they can sequence things such that they no guard the one really big attack, unless you hit crit exactly. And then they perfect guard one of the other big attacks, and then they guard one of them from hand, and then they just no guard the last thing, and then they only go up 1 or 2 damage a turn. So even though this is unless you're, when you're going first, this is really hard to overcome. But when your opponent's going first, they get a turn with Twin Drive, a lot of opportunities to draw shield value into plus cards, and then it's much more manageable for them. So when you're going second, the game gets really grindy. So it's really important when you're going second to get old levidras into your soul on turn 3 to divine skill right away. This gives you more kill pressure because your Vanguard gets a crit and 10k right off the bat. So immediately they have to PG your Vanguard or risk getting you crit stacking them because you're also manipulating the top of your deck. So they're probably going to PG the Vanguard, which is going to eat 2 cards out of their hand. And then the rest of your attacks, they're going to have to think about taking or guarding, but they're going to be down a PG already. And then for the rest of the game, after you push them up damage, they have to guard the Vanguard because it threatens crits for lethal. So that strains their shield value a lot more. It gives you 3 markers on their side to survive their first Persona Ride turn since they get one before you. And it lets you just have a much better chance of scaling into the late game. As you can see, once you have the setup where all your circles are markers, these numbers are tremendous. The Vanguard attacking with 2 old levidras and Soul, with a marker on the booster behind it and Persona Ride active, this is plus 20 right off the bat, and then plus 10 with Divine Skill if you went first. So that's already plus 30 for a 43k Vanguard, and then it's going to get plus 15 from the Foxhole's base effects. So that is 58, and then the marker would make it 68. And if this is on the Divine Skill turn, then you also have a crit. So it's 68 with a crit. They have to perfect guard it. And then if you hit crits, because you stacked your deck, they might, if they're at 4, for instance, then you're just going to put crits on 2 different things, and now they have to deal with this twice. And guard 2 more big numbers with crit and potentially die. So you can apply a lot of pressure. If you like hit a crit early and push your opponent up to high damage, it can sometimes be worth going for this pattern, especially if you have a lot of cards in hand, to try to see if you can just like empty their hand to survive and leave them either dead or close to dead with not much else to do. But usually you're not going to do this. This is like when you're playing really aggressive. More often, you're going to be doing something like 2 markers on the opponent's side every turn, 1 marker on your side, and on the Divine Skill turn, 1 more marker on your side. And either you use the Divine Skill marker to put the second marker on their side and you go for another marker on yours, or you do 1 more marker on their side like this for just to shut down 1 column, or you go like this behind their Vanguard so that all 3 of their attacks are shrank. That's going to depend. Some decks have a booster they have to use, like Rezael and Varga, and so putting 1 behind the Vanguard can get like a guaranteed minus 10k in draw and make it much easier to 2 to pass their Vanguard. So that is a valid strategy. How you put these markers on the opponent's side is going to come down to the matchups every time. For example, against and then the other against Leal, you're going to be not putting 1 behind the Vanguard, but you're going to be putting it on the rear guards. Against some decks like Shiranui, you're going to be doubling up on front row rear guard spots because they restand, so you'll shrink 2 attacks in a row and things like that. So you just got to know how your deck plays against their deck, how their deck's plan is to kill you, so on and so forth. And you have to remember that if your opponent can sequence their attacks such that they can avoid you letting you use the marker on an early swing, they will if they're good, which means that if you're depending on the markers to draw into more defensive power, you need to split them so that no matter how they attack, they have to give you a card draw off of 1 of your markers first, which can be difficult to do depending on the circumstances, but it is something you have to look for. This deck gets really complicated to play defensively once you start getting into that. The mirror match is also really complicated, and also on top of that, it's really hard to keep track of whose markers are whose. If you and your opponent have the same sleeves for your Infinity Eyes markers, it's a nightmare. So keep an eye out for that. It might be worth unsleeving your markers if you're playing against an opponent with the same sleeves as you for their tokens and markers. You do need to keep track of which marker belongs to which player, because a lot of your effects specify your markers, not the opponent's markers or any player's markers, your markers. So keep that in mind. But this is the deck. It's not too pricey right now. A lot of this stuff was cheap in the previous format. So if you picked up old levidras, it's now pretty easy to build into new levidras. And it's a really solid deck that has pretty good matchup spread against the format, and it has a really good matchup against Varga. So it's pretty solidly positioned right now, and it's really good at playing the long game, and it can get surprisingly aggressive when it wants to. So it's really good if you'd like to feel like you're in the driver's seat for your matches. And if you like playing defensive grindy decks, I am going to be playing this deck for the foreseeable future, probably every event that I can, unless someone wants to lend me Leal Odium, because I also think that deck's really cool, and I might play that if my friends let me borrow it or something. And also, if this deck starts falling off, I would play Varga, but this deck isn't going to fall off. It did really well in Japan for the entire format. It was neck and neck with Rezael for best performing deck. They have a difference of 1 for their first place finishes in the Japanese format. They have no difference in their top 4 finishes. They only have a difference of 8 in their top 8s, and a difference of 6 for their top 16 finishes. These are really close thresholds. These are basically like 1 or 2 events, a bunch of people all took Rezael, and there was like a top 8 that was all Rezael, and that was enough to push these numbers. But their first place finishes, being 9 and 8 respectively, means that these decks are basically equal. Rezael being a deck that operates on a slightly different axis of manipulating triggers, stacking the deck, trying to hit heals defensively, and grinding out with a with a long game plan. But whereas we're trying to do like we don't manipulate the deck as much as Raziel does, and we have 5 attacks right away, so we're a bit more aggressive than they are. Things like that. But they're doing very similar things, and they have very similar power levels. So yeah, these are both. This is a really solid deck. It goes pretty even with Raziel too, so this is a really solid pick, and it's going to be good for the foreseeable future, I believe. I think even in the limited amount of set 6 format events we've had in Japan, in the Japanese format, it's still Raziel with 16 tops and levidras with 12 tops. So it's, for this format and the next format, it's going to be a good pick. That's it for now. I'm really excited to play this. I hope that you give it a shot, or if you hate this deck, that you learn something with this video about maybe how to deal with it. But that's all for now. As always, good luck card fighting.